Today we're at the beach and we're going to take some landscape photos, and we're going to be looking at the rules of composition. But this isn't just going to be another straightforward guide to composition. Instead, I'm going to show you how to cheat.
Composition is one of the most vital skills to learn as a photographer, especially if you're into landscape photography. On a stormy, grey day like this, we can't rely on beautiful light or a glorious sky, so instead, composition becomes even more vital. So the plan is to produce several landscapes that each adhere to a different compositional rule. But rather than seeking out naturally occurring shapes in the scene, we're going to do a little creative landscaping of our own. For our first compositional rule, we'll look at frames within frames. And this is a great compositional trick to look out for, not just in landscapes but in all kinds of photography. By surrounding our subject with other elements in the scene, we can create a natural frame that draws the eye to the important parts of the image. This usually involves seeking out natural elements that can be composed to create the frame. But what if no natural frame presents itself? A straightforward shot of the tower here is nice enough, but the composition is rather boring, especially with that dull grey sky. So instead, I'm fashioning my own frame within a frame using a piece of bush taped to my tripod. By arranging the branches so that they add detail around the edges of my image, I can create my frame within a frame. Now, as you can see, this was a bit of a struggle when stood on top of a cliff in extremely windy conditions. So rather than spending all day waiting for a drop in the wind, instead I captured the branches in several positions using a tripod to keep my camera perfectly still. Then I pieced several shots together afterwards to build the frame. Another fantastic compositional trick is to seek out leading lines. This is where we compose for lines within a scene that lead the eye inwards towards the important parts of the image. So this time I found a piece of driftwood further down the shore that I want to use in my frame. By laying it in the foreground, I can create a leading line that draws the eye through the frame. Using a wide angle and a low camera position lets me exaggerate the perspective so that the driftwood forms a strong shape in the lower half of the image and leads the eye in towards the waterfall. Compared to the more straightforward shot, the driftwood lends a much stronger shape to the image. Next up, let's look at making a point of interest. This is one of the rules of composition that I find especially useful for landscape photography. Every frame should have a point of interest, something that leads the eye to a specific part of the image. But with the stormy seas and grey skies here, there's nothing obvious to use as a focal point for the scene. Without a subject, it's nice enough, but the composition could be stronger. So I'm going to use myself as a point of interest. To add to the mood, I fitted a neutral density filter, which allowed me to extend the shutter speed to 2 seconds, resulting in blurred motion over the water and a few wet clothes. Finally, it can often be useful to compose to include foreground detail like a rock or a plant. By framing objects close to the camera in combination with distant scenery, we can achieve a harmonious, balanced composition. However, this is another cheat. It's a composite of 2 photos in Photoshop. I'll show you how it's done. In this video, I'm going to explain how we can build our own landscape scenes. I've got 2 different images here. This image here of the mountains and the sky, and another image here where we can use these rocks and posts in the foreground. I'm going to show you how we can create a composite from the 2 frames to create our very own landscape scene. So let's get cracking. I'm going to go to this image of the mountains here. I'm going to grab the move tool and click and drag it up to the tab of my other image and down and in and release to copy the mountains over. Then I'm going to bring up my layers panel here by going to window, layers. Let's perhaps lower the opacity of that layer slightly and we'll bring them into position perhaps somewhere around about here, I think. Now let's increase the opacity back up to 100, and then what I need to do is blend the seams to kind of make a smooth transition between the foreground details and the background mountains. So I'm going to click the add layer mask icon here in the layers panel. Then I'm going to grab the brush tool, set my foreground color to black here, and I'll right click and make sure the hardness of my brush is right down at 0, and then I can just paint. You can see that allows me to blend in the two layers like this. So we want to make sure we get a nice smooth transition. I'm not worried about the posts, we're going to deal with those in a second. So we can hit X if we want to flip back to white to reveal parts of our layer, and then hit X to flip to black to hide parts of the layer. So you can see we can get quite a smooth transition very quickly between our two different layers. Now we need to be a bit more precise where these posts are. So I'm going to hide that top layer for the moment, highlight the bottom layer, then I'm going to grab the quick selection tool from the tools panel, and I'm going to zoom in over these posts and just paint over them with the quick selection tool to get an accurate selection of these little details here. I'll just finish off with these two posts here, and once that's done, we can perhaps try and improve the selection edge just by using the select and mask command very quickly. Let's perhaps just set the radius to around about 4 or 5. We'll set output to selection and hit OK. Then I'm going to reveal and highlight the mask on that top layer again. And now we've got our selection made, we can paint over these areas precisely to hide the parts of the top layer, revealing the posts on the layer below. So I'm going to grab the brush tool here, set my foreground color to black again, and then just paint over those details like that. And this gives us a more precise blend between the two layers. And with that done, I can hit Command or Control and D to deselect. Let's just zoom out to full screen and see how we're looking. If I toggle that layer off and on, you can see the difference that makes. Now, if we want to tweak the position of our mountains here, what we can do is click the little link here that links the layer mask to the image, and then we can highlight the image part of the layer by clicking the image thumbnail here, and then use the move tool to drag it around. And you can see we can move it around, but because the mask stays in place, we can kind of tweak the positioning without affecting our layer mask at all. We might want to make it slightly larger, so I'm going to hit Command or Control and T, hold Shift and drag the bounding box outwards slightly and position it like this, then hit Enter to apply. So now my two layers are blended together quite nicely. What I'm going to do is use another layer to kind of finish off the effect. So I'm going to highlight the top layer, then use the keyboard shortcut Command or Control, Shift, Alt and E to merge a copy of those two layers below into a new layer at the top of the stack there. Then I'm going to take this layer into the Camera Raw filter. So I'm going to go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. Now let's perhaps just tweak the settings here to make everything kind of come together more nicely. I'm going to tweak the colors, and that just helps to bring the different elements together to make them gel a bit more naturally. So I'm going to bring the colors to about there. Let's perhaps just increase the saturation and drop down the vibrance a touch. We could also perhaps just darken down the sky. So I'm going to use the graduated filter, dial in some negative exposure, and then click and drag down over the sky to boost the sky details there. Let's perhaps up the clarity a touch and add a touch more saturation to the sky. Let's go back to our basic panel and perhaps just add a touch of clarity and a touch of contrast. Maybe we could tweak the shadows a little like this and the highlights. And let's add perhaps a vignette. So I'm going to grab the radial filter, dial in some negative exposure, hold Command or Control and double click to add a vignette that snaps to the edges of the frame there. And I'm pretty happy with that. Let's perhaps maybe just tweak the exposure a little and knock down the saturation a touch. And I'll hit OK to apply. And that's my finished image. So there we go. That's how to blend two photos to come up with an entirely new scene.